The first sign that you're stuck in the spiritual shadow is that you haven't questioned your faith or lack of faith. But the second sign is that you're always questioning your faith or your lack of faith, at least according to these psychology books and the spiritual psychology books, which we're going to be unpacking in this 22-part extravaganza of spiritual shadow exploration. This isn't a mainstream video. I'm not somebody who's interested in shallow, feel-good understandings of spirituality. What I'm trying to do with these 22 signs of spiritual shadow material is give you a comprehensive understanding of the golden shadow, the higher potential of spirituality, and the more classical, repressed, darker, negatively oriented shadow through my framework that I teach inside my course, the Shadow Work Library, based on shadow territories, shadow entities, and shadow behaviors. I'm taking a more or less complex system of multi-level unconscious shadow material and making it bite-sized and fun for YouTube so that you can be encouraged to watch along a few minutes on each point, and you'll also be able to know where your spiritual shadow is seeking a bit more illumination, or maybe the golden light from the golden shadow is seeking to penetrate your own consciousness. Nonetheless, the first two signs of being stuck in the spiritual shadow are that you're never questioning of your faith, normally the faith that you're born into or the lack of faith that you're born into, or on the other end of the spectrum, you're always questioning your faith. This is the person who was raised atheist and they're still atheist, or the person that was raised Christian and they're still Christian, or conversely, you're a Christian but you don't fully accept your Christianity or your nature of being a generally universal New Age type of spiritual individual. It doesn't matter what the doctrine or the belief system is. The spiritual shadow becomes problematic when you refuse to budge out of your fixed mindset, your fixed spiritual mindset. This is a major problem if you're someone who stays in the religion that you were born into and you haven't gone through a period of genuine soul searching. This isn't to say that you were born into the wrong religion or that your religion is false. I'm not going to make any claims to any kind of true religion in this video. What I am going to try and encourage you to do is take an honest look at your genuine psychological, spiritual searching impulse and find a way to express that in your faith. Depending on the side of reality that you're born into, either a more atheistic family tradition or a more strictly religious tradition or anywhere in between, you could fall into either side of compulsion. I see this in clients that I work with. They either remain rigidly fixed in the same perspective that they inherited, and of course, they stunt their spiritual growth as a result. They're not asking original questions, or they're asking way too many questions. Which then makes me think, well, do you truly believe in this faith that you say you believe in if you can't go a single day without questioning your faith? For a certain period of time, sometimes for many years in a row, people struggle with the question of true belief. And I understand that. Even if you're non-denominational, you're someone who's into the idea of the universe and feeling out energies and synchronicities, it's normal to be in a questioning period of time. For some people, this could be 3 years to 5 years of deep spiritual searching, especially if you're spiritually seeking and spiritually healing at the same time. But at what point do we need to stop questioning our faith? And at what point, conversely, do we need to start questioning our faith? Very open-ended introduction to the video, but maybe you've already indicated inside of yourself, based on these two broad spectrums, which side you might be tilted towards. The third sign of spiritual shadow, or being stuck in the spiritual shadow, moving rapidly now from my list over here, is that you have a bit of spiritual grandiosity. If you're interested in the Bible, as it were, maybe not the best choice of words, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, or the ancient channeled text academic equivalent of all of these issues, read Halfway Up the Mountain, The Error of Premature Claims to Enlightenment. I think that's what it says in the front. This book is pure gold. Many of the issues I'm talking about in this video are discussed in detail in here. It's pretty much every stumbling block that you could encounter, many of the inflations, many of the deflations, dozens and dozens of contributors, psychologists, spiritual teachers, people of literary articulate-mindedness. They go into your pain in a way that you've never considered. This book is really one of the top spiritual shadow books I've encountered from reading hundreds upon hundreds of books on these issues. So please get this. Get it before it's gone. They're probably not printing it anymore. Just as a note, just halfway up the mountain, read this essay collection. With that being said, one of the things that you'll find in that book is this third issue of spiritual grandiosity. There's many flavors and many forms of being spiritually grandiose, but for the sake of this single point, I'm going to focus on this idea that you're God's favorite. You believe that you're a special soul with a special mission. And yes, you are. We're all touched by the fingerprint of God, and surely if we have faith, there must be some degree of divine plan or some potential for something wonderful in this life. We're not here simply to suffer and then to pass into nothingness. There must be an opportunity for growth and love and spiritual significance. But the spiritually grandiose individual takes the original spark of a spiritual inspiration and they puff it up beyond proportion. They become somebody who is really far too invested in their own specialness. You might see this in friends or family members or people in various members of your religious community. But also, please take the time to look into your own shadow and consider how your own spiritual grandiosity might be getting in the way of a genuine spiritual path. If you're interested in shadow material overall, there are 2 foundational books I want you to read. Of course, Meeting the Shadow essay collection, The Dark Side of Human Nature. This is almost 50 contributors, same as the Halfway Up the Mountain book. Fantastic overview of shadow psychology from a Jungian and depth psychology perspective. And also Robert Johnson's classic readable, read this on a single evening, Owning Your Own Shadow. Bestseller for a reason. These 2 books, you'll find them on Amazon side by side, and if you're interested in good Amazon reads related to these issues, you'll notice that many of the books I recommend on this channel at this point, by God's grace, are all interconnected over on the algorithm. If this is your first time finding me, I've been doing this for a few years, and my community is a community of keen psychological nerds, and we like to influence the other customers also looked at this item. Other customers also bought this item maybe a year from now. If this video does well, this book will be recommended beside this book because people will go and buy the 2 books in the same single sitting, and Amazon has been trained by this channel. You'll see it. You'll see it across the channel. But maybe I'm being spiritually grandiose. That's where I need to check myself. We'll move on to the 4th point. The 4th sign of spiritual stuckness is that you tolerate toxic substances and situations that poison your body and soul. How can you genuinely believe? This is where the paradox comes in. On one hand, you have a spiritual grandiosity, you believe in your specialness, but on the other hand, you still tolerate poisonous situations and substances. Drink, drugs, vices, cigarettes, the obvious substances, but also the situations. The toxic family environment, the toxic relationship, the toxic work environment, your literal toxicity in your environment because you haven't removed the mold from the walls and you don't focus on high quality water, getting enough airflow, all of these things, you're still burning cheap incense rather than using essential oils. All of this, any kind of toxicity, if you truly want to sanctify and you truly relate to the spiritual being that you are, why would you poison yourself? It's a blind spot for many people, and I'm not perfect in this either. I hope it's clear throughout this entire video. I'm talking about a theme which I'm also struggling with. Many of these 22 points, I've been there. Some of them, I'm still there. I'm not going to make it too much about me, but I really am on this journey alongside you, and I'm still trying to find ways to cut out the toxicity that honestly drains the spiritual energy out of my body. One of the major themes for the last 2 months for me has been cutting out the scroll states, stopping the endless consumption on the screen, not just the crappy, obvious, short-form junk food, but even videos like this one. When do we give the time to look inwards if we're always listening to a man or a woman on the internet through our headphone, speakerphone, always speaking to us? There's too much noise, there's too much inflow, it's polluting at the very least, but it could be poisonous at the worst. The sign that you're stuck in spiritual shadow is that you take too much and you don't pause to release. You're not purifying your inflow, and don't be surprised if you lose contact with the deeper part of yourself. Let's move on to the 5th sign that you're stuck in the spiritual shadow. There's 2 elements here, and there's the 5th sign and the 6th sign. They all go together. I'll just go for the first one, the performative preaching and the secret hypocrite. You might see this easier in people outside of yourself. It's often a very difficult shadow to identify within just your own introspective practice, but look out for the performative preaching, look out for the articulation or the language of spiritual benevolence or spiritual power that isn't backed up with the actions. If someone's preaching love and kindness, but they're shouting at their children, they're a bit of a spiritual hypocrite. If somebody's preaching that they really love God, they love Jesus, they love Allah, they love their particular religious figure, and yet they don't act in that way. They're all talk and no action. It's an obvious point, but it somehow goes blind to most people, especially when you look at your own life. What are you saying that you're not doing? And then the sixth point coming here, performative aesthetics. Performative spiritual aesthetics. This is one of my pet peeves, especially within the New Age or spiritual but not religious space. You see people wearing the mandalas, or like myself, wearing the cross, wearing any kind of iconography. Maybe they have the flowy hippie robes and they're the spiritual person. They're not attached to any religion. All religions are equal, right? But they just have that feel about them that isn't quite healthy or genuinely spiritual. They look very spiritual. They've got the flowy robes, or they even wear the traditional outfits. For example, within Islam, maybe you veil, or maybe you wear a hijab, or maybe you're not cutting your hair or your beard because of a certain practice as a man within a certain faith. You have the aesthetic. You have the spiritual performative aesthetic, but it's not backed up with your actions. This is a wide point, and I'm not trying to shame anyone. I'm not trying to preach in a way which will put other people down. Just watch out for your own hypocrisy and hypocritical nature, and take a bit of coconut water just to rehydrate. Far more refreshing. Let's move on to the seventh sign of spiritual shadow, religious intolerance. It's an obvious point. I don't need to explain it too much, but if you are a Christian who truly does not believe that your Muslim brother or sister is heading towards or on the same path, or by some people's estimation, in contact with the same essence of divinity and spirituality that you are, they might pray 5 times a day in a different style of building, in a different language. Why are you intolerant of that? This is really a huge problem in certain Christian fragmentations in the American culture in particular, where certain groups are cast away, other groups artificially pump themselves up. This is the previous point about spiritual grandiosity. The religious intolerance. It's a major spiritual shadow. You're clearly in a shadow boxing relationship. If your religion has to be right and everyone else's religion has to be wrong, and you're wasting the mental and spiritual energy attacking their faith, what are you doing? I don't need to go too deep into that one, but just look out for those patterns inside yourself. If you have a private, subtle narrative that your religion's better than the other religion, maybe it is, but maybe you just grew up in a certain cultural context where you can't relate to the language of their text. For example, I have a Quran on my desk and I have a Bible. I can't read Arabic. I don't understand the poetic and lyrical flow of the text if I were reciting it out loud, because I just cannot access that. I also can't access the original Hebrew or original Greek of the Bible. I can't access Eastern texts that are in different languages. I just can't do that. And it's also not my culture. I grew up in English churchyards and English small churches and the Christian culture that we have in this nation. It's very Western style. So I'm imprinted with that. And my religious intolerance might come up in assumptions or biases or projections towards people of other faith who look a different way to me. Just watch out for it. The eighth sign that you're stuck in spiritual shadow is that you're spiritually bypassing, or you've got an obsession with the spirit self. This is similar to the previous point that we made about spiritual grandiosity, but where I want you to really focus on this distinction is that the spiritual bypass need not necessarily be an inflated state of spiritual identity. The spiritually grandiose individual puts themselves up, they pump themselves up, they believe that they're God's favorite. The spiritual bypasser may not believe that they're God's favorite, but at the very least, they want to hang out with God. They want to hang out with the soul more than doing anything else. This is a point which is lost quite often when you're in the spiritual healing, spiritual awakening stage. There's a natural obsession, there's a natural fascination with spirituality. But at what point do you need to calm it down a little bit? In the same way that if you start dating someone new and they're exciting and wonderful, and aren't they so beautiful, and don't they smell just excellent? You want to be near them. You want to be with them. You want to try and get close to them. That same feeling, when contextualized in the context of your own soul or your relationship to God, must be brought into attention. It's a spiritual shadow which has the risk of taking you out of reality. It's appropriate that you go on dates with your soul or with God. It's appropriate that you have your practices. But if your work life's suffering, your family life is suffering, and you're neglecting your health and your day-to-day routines because you're spiritually bypassing into spiritual states or spiritual practices, it's going to catch up with you eventually. Again, every point that I'm making in this video does have a nuance and a contextual basis. It's normal to go towards a spiritual bypass, and maybe it's an appropriate time to bring out another book that I want you to read. This is usually what happens when someone has entered into a state of spiritual emergency. You can see the theme throughout this video, another essay collection. The reason I'm bringing out these essay collections for this video is that you don't need to rely on just my perspective or just the perspective of one psychologist. If we take this book, Spiritual Emergency, this book, Halfway Up the Mountain, and also look at the Jungian psychology of Meeting the Shadow, there are hundreds of teachers across these three books. Probably close to 200. I might be slightly exaggerating, but at least 150. So many perspectives on the same themes, and different language will land with you in a different way. You can look out for the patterns of spiritual bypassing by looking into the state that it's coming from. If you feel a spiritual woundedness, if you feel a spiritual apathy, and if you feel a sense of being alienated from God or your soul, it's very normal to want to try and heal that. You want to be in contact with something that's greater, but make sure that you place limits and boundaries about how much time you spend in that state. Let's move on to the ninth sign actually. The ninth sign of spiritual shadow and being stuck in a state that you don't want to be in. This is going a little bit too far into your spirituality, and it's believing that you have no individual power, no individual agency, no individual willpower, because it's all God. You are an instrument or a vessel or a custodian of God's consciousness. You are a servant of God, and therefore your agency, your willpower, it's irrelevant. If you start thinking on a philosophical level that you don't have an ability to enact change in the world because fundamentally these hands are controlled by a higher power, this voice is controlled by a higher power, you're in contact with something true, but you've missed out on an integration between the material self and the spiritual self. You need to have an integrated, mature ego to be a custodian and a transmitter of that spiritual energy. It's something which comes up in the final book, which I recommend in this video, Stacking Them All Up Front, Michael Washburn's fantastic Embodied Spirituality in a Sacred World. This is high-level transpersonal psychology, the most advanced of all of the books I'm recommending. This is the end point of the spiritual psychological journey. And Michael Washburn is an expert with decades of research into ego psychology and spiritual growth, and he weaves them together in a way that avoids this issue. Yes, you do have a gift from God to a certain degree. Yes, you can heal your body and your soul to such a degree that you become an instrument for God's good work in this world. But don't lose sight of the fact that you have your own willpower, your own agency, and there's an ability to be directive, which is somewhat distinct from God. Paradoxically, and for me to contradict myself immediately, if God is all, then really there's no distinction, but from a basic dualistic sense, a material sense of you have your name, I have my name, and we are individual selves, we need to work within the context of partnership with God, partnership with our soul, not too much of a union, too close, because otherwise we get too disparate and you end up in a state of spiritual emergency, or at least you're walking the line towards spiritual emergency. If you lose your agency, eventually you'll lose a sense of self. Some people would say that's the whole point of the spiritual journey by the Eastern traditions. The end point is the extinguishing of the self. To get to nirvana means that your ego has been fully integrated and transcended. And some would say that it disappears depending on the tradition. That's fantastic for end-of-life spirituality. But you're watching this video today in the middle of your life. You're not in your final days. You still need your adult ego identity, and your agency is in service and partnership with God's intention. So don't lose all of that because you're aiming towards that which feels better. It's an important point to really sit with. The 10th sign, nonetheless, that you're stuck in spiritual shadow is that you're synchronicity obsessed. You keep looking for signs. Every time you look at the microwave, it has to be 111 or 555. When you wake up in the morning and you see those angel numbers, guess what? You feel like the day is going to be blessed, and you can't help but look at license plates when you're driving and see the messages. You can't help but see the fact that you dreamt about a certain animal and then you see it on your walk, and all those messages, all those timings, you think of someone, they message you, you message someone else, and then endless synchronicities. There's a degree of truth in every point that I'm making here. The reason that it's a spiritual shadow psychology video is that spiritual shadow is either at the lower end of the unconscious or the higher end of the unconscious from a psychosynthesis psychosynthesis perspective, you've got the higher unconscious, which is the realm of the golden shadow, the higher possibility, the highest charge, the heavenly realm, simply put, and the lower unconscious, which is the primal drives, the more baseline reactions, which are more negatively tilted, and this is where things like jealousy and anger and rage and selfishness come in. You've got a rough structure. Middle unconscious is where we can generally move while still being able to be in contact with things that we don't identify as ourselves, but we're in contact with them. True unconscious territory, it's beyond the bands of perception. That's what I'm trying to expand in this video. Beyond the bands of perception doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or it's wrong. I would say, to a large degree, that it's beautiful to be experiencing synchronicities. For many years in my life, I've been having more or less consistent synchronicities of clients that I need to work with, videos that I need to make, comments that come through. Comments is a wonderful one for me because I'll think of an idea, or maybe I'll have an opinion of myself, or have some kind of possible direction of exploration. I go, that would be a good place to go. Open up my phone, 2 comments that day on random videos from the last 2 or 3 years, and they confirm that I should go there. I'm like, okay, I'll take the sign, or I have a belief that I'm not doing a certain type of work in a way that's optimized, and someone will say, hey Jordan, if you think that you're like this, then know that you're like this. I'm like, okay. Clearly, they picked up the energy. Something was happening. It's beautiful. It's magical. You get these moments in your family life, in your relationship life, in experiences with nature, experiences with your own body, experiences in your dreams. Don't deny the synchronicity. Pay attention to the signs. But if you're not taking forwards action, if you're not loving both yourself and other people because you're looking for a sign to go further, you're looking for some confirmation from God, you're trying to test God and saying, God, give me a sign. At what stage are you being a little bit distorted in your thinking? This goes back to the previous point about not having agency. You become too spiritually involved and you lose that sense of individual action. The 2 points come together. Many of the points in this video will come together and shift one way or the other in terms of overt passivity or overt activity. It's a broad spectrum of emotional charge. Just pay attention to if you're a little bit too hooked on spiritual synchronicities, because yes, they are wonderful, but ultimately they need to be placed in the correct proportion. Moving now to the halfway point of the video, the 11th sign that you're stuck in the spiritual shadow is that you feel a sense of purposelessness. You feel a sense of insignificance, meaninglessness, or dread. If you have genuine faith of whichever tradition you may be a part of, how can you feel purposelessness? How can you feel meaninglessness? How, outside of that period of the dark night of the soul, or the regression in the service of transcendence, the aridity of the senses, out of that period of desolation, which may last for a few years, but if it's been 10 years or 20 years of you being genuine in your faith, how can you doubt what you're here for? How can you doubt the purpose of life? If you're interested in deep faith, surely there's an element of hope which is nested right at the center of your belief. You can't lack meaning if you're attached and involved in a meaningful system of belief. So if you have this faithless feeling, if you have a low-grade dread, go deeper into your faith, whatever it might be. And again, go back to the start of this video. You might be over-questioning your faith or under-questioning your faith or your lack of faith, depending on the system and the culture that you were born into. You can't have genuine meaninglessness if you're genuine in your faith. Not for a period of time, maybe. That period of time, I get it. But over the course of a lifetime, true faith, true belief is naturally all-inspiring. At least from my perspective, from my belief, that's what's happened to me. When I moved from atheist, I was born atheist, my family was very anti-religion, and I gradually gained my faith through initially starting meditation when I was about 17, 18 years old, then going on my own fasting experiences, studying the world's religions, and of course, doing the work that I do now as a teacher, someone who does therapeutic work, someone who does coaching work, and this channel, of course. I enact my faith, I enact my belief, and I try and put good energy, as cliche as it is, out into the world. You can't maintain that sense of dread and apathy if you're truly in contact with the divinity of your soul and the divinity of God. That's my personal belief. Maybe that's a bias that you disagree with, but I see it as a genuine spiritual shadow of people who are just, they haven't broken through. They've gone from a light room into a dark corridor, and they forget that the other end of the dark corridor is an even brighter room. Or you can always just go back to the faith that worked before. Normally, you have to go forwards, but just know that it's a temporary faithlessness. The 12th sign that you're stuck in spiritual shadow related point, and this is something which kind of relates to the first 2 points, but actually it's a more specific variant, which I wanted to say for halfway through the video. You haven't moved into agnosticism. And what I mean by this is that you have a prolonged period of atheism or a prolonged period of culturally inherited Christianity or Islamic faith or Buddhist faith. You have a prolonged period where you just go with the flow of what you were born into, or you refuse to enter into the questioning state overall. This seems very, very similar to the original point about over-questioning or under-questioning, but I believe personally, and I've seen this in my client work, that the agnostic state is a middle ground position. People who are super atheist or super religious, they find it uncomfortable to maintain that middle ground perspective of agnosticism. They need to shift. They have this sudden shadow pendulum swing from one extreme to the other. They were born one way, they go the other way. I get it. It spirals around. But surely you should be centered in an agnostic perspective. Many of the people I find who are of the deepest belief, even if they found a certain tradition, maybe they're Jewish, for example, they still have enough agnosticism inside of themselves to say, you know what, I have been reading some of the Hindu texts, and I don't know. I do have faith in my God, in my system, but that agnostic feeling, that agnostic stance is something which people can really settle into. Arguably, in terms of lifelong spiritual development, to have the agnostic base is the best place to be. You don't want to be too far in one direction because you're going to be out of contact with the opposite polarity. But if you're right in the middle, you can look at atheism and you can look at belief and you can look at many different forms of belief or different forms of atheism and get a grounded and measured perspective, because you're in equal proportion. Just something to consider, maybe bring yourself back, maybe bring yourself towards the center, but try and center nonetheless. The 13th sign of spiritual shadow, being stuck in the spiritual shadow, is very much related to, well, the 14th sign, because it's another polarity one. The 13th sign is that you're not reading the spiritual texts or the spiritual scriptures. The 14th sign is that you're reading too much of the spiritual texts and spiritual scriptures. What a headache for me to try and talk about. How can you decide if you're reading too much Bible, reading too much channeled text, reading too much Buddhist literature, or not enough at all? It depends on your particular situation. If you're somebody who says, I am a Muslim man, and you haven't read the Quran in a month, are you really a Muslim man? Yes. And also, there's an element of your faith which is clearly lacking because you're not in contact with the scripture. The scripture that you say you believe in, why wouldn't you move towards that? Yes, there's shame and there's narratives, and I get it. There's all kinds of things. On the extreme other end of the spectrum, if you're overindulging in religious texts, and this is something that you'll see if someone spends too many hours, and what is too many hours reading spiritual texts? Well, it depends on what you're doing outside of those hours. If you're reading the spiritual text and you're practicing and you're doing good works and you're balancing yourself out with a generally holistic lifestyle, you're probably not reading too much. Some people enjoy reading their spiritual books for hours and hours per day. I enjoy reading books for hours per day. But the majority of the day isn't spent in the books. Some of it should be. And also, paradoxically, these 2 points together, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum that you can self-assess yourself on, and the easy question to ask is, are you reading the right amount of spiritual literature based on this stage of your journey? Not what was relevant a year ago, not what will be relevant, not what will be relevant in a year's time. Based on this part of your journey, are you reading as much as you should? Just pause with that. You might need to dial it down, you might need to dial it up. Super practical. Let's move on into the 15th sign of being stuck in the spiritual shadow. This one's a little bit spicy, so I'm going to take a sip of coconut water to calm myself down, because this one's going to be very triggering. 15th sign that you're stuck in spiritual shadow is that you're emotionally dysregulated outside of spiritual spaces. You can't control your emotions, you can't balance your own inner world unless you're meditating, praying, or in a religious community. This is a major problem in the spiritual but not religious camp. People who are generally spiritually minded, going to the workshops, going to the retreats, or otherwise only hanging around their other spiritual friends, you see patterns of emotional dysregulation, anger suddenly flaring up, depression, sadness, coldness, apathy, suddenly crushing them down, an inability to move forwards, an inability to get ahead with their career, with their business, or heal something in their romantic relationship, unless it's happening in the religious circle. or the spiritual space, or unless they've just had their 1 hour meditation. I want you to have these practices, don't get me wrong. I want you to be in communion with your soul and with other people who are in communion with their soul. But if you have an inability to downregulate or upregulate, either take down the charge because it's all too much, or bring up the charge because you're sunken, unless you go into your spiritual practices, and this is a consistent theme in your life, the spiritual shadow has really got you in a stranglehold. Quite literally, you're choked up in your emotions. You don't have the ability to step outside of your spiritual persona and realize that you do have probably some unresolved trauma issues, and you also have some attachment or relationship issues as well, which is why you keep getting triggered by all of these various situations. You can work on this, you can heal this, but just notice that if you're doing more than just band-aiding or occasionally leaning on your spirituality as a healthy crutch, and it's something which is a permanent reliance, you're probably caught in emotional dysregulation, and your spirituality at a certain point gets in the way. It's a triggering point to reflect on, but that's why it's called a point. It's penetrating. It literally hurts to receive information like that if you know you've been caught in that pattern. I get it. I've been there. I know what it's like. I know what it's like to want to meditate for 2 hours, because if you just go with the 1 hour meditation, well, suddenly the meditation's over, and then you have to go and respond to the emails or finish off the school work and just get into that difficult conversation with your partner, whatever it might be. It's tempting. It's very, very, very tempting to stay in the spiritual bypass. Try and remove yourself from it. You'll be a more balanced individual. The 16th sign of being stuck in spiritual shadow, looking again at my list, is another polarity. Here's the theme of the video. Relates to the 17th sign. 16th, too much praying, too much practice, too much meditation. This is what we just spoke about. The 17th sign, not enough praying, not enough practice, not enough meditation. The third polarity that I'm bringing up in this video, hopefully the point is clear right now. We need to find a balanced perspective. How much prayer, how much practice, how much meditation is appropriate for you in this season of your life? For me personally, I could probably do with a bit more prayer and a bit more meditation, because I'm focused on research, I'm focused on teaching, and I'm focused on my client work. Whereas a few years back, I had a lot more time that I devoted. I still have the time, but I don't choose to devote it. I don't choose to commit it to deep contemplative practices. I do just enough. I spend a couple hours per week in these states, but I could probably do a little bit more because it strengthens me for this work. That's my self-assessment. Bring myself into the video just a little bit. I know intuitively I could do with a little bit more prayer, a little bit more practice. And yes, if I honestly reflect back to where I was maybe 5 years ago, I could probably do with a bit less prayer and a bit more action. Find your middle point, again, this balancing central point, and know that the seasons of life will dictate what is appropriate. Depending on the amount of pain or trauma or suffering that you're dealing with, it's appropriate to be praying and contemplating and meditating more than most people would deem necessary. But if you have responsibilities in the world for your family, for your business, or for people who are around you in your local community, maybe someone like yourself, your own responsibility to yourself, to look after yourself, to be eating healthy, to be training, to be exercising, to be studying and learning, and just watch out for when something which is beautiful becomes something which is dreadful. Spending too much time in the meditative state can take away from a beautiful state outside of meditation, and of course, from my perspective, I would see meditation and prayer and contemplation as a focused way of tapping into a certain band of consciousness, and then you bring that back as a permeating influence in your everyday life, something which I really want to try and bring into more of my life, and of course we're all a work in progress. Moving over those 2 points now, we're on number 18. Number 18, maybe a bit of a curveball, but it relates to a lot of people. 18th sign, you're stuck in the spiritual shadow, is that you're caught in guru worship. A teacher, a guide, a preacher, a literal Eastern-style guru. You're fixated on the words that they say, or the energy that they bring out into the environment, and to a certain degree, you're outsourcing your own authentic inner exploration. There's an intuitive feeling of when this is happening. Some people are way too off the deep end. You see cult communities opening up where people, for example, we could look at a church, controversial opinion, but the person who goes to a church on a Sunday, to listen to the sermon or the homily or something that's prepared for 35, 40, 60 minutes on the Bible, but they don't read the Bible in between. You're outsourcing your own experience of that text, and if you're not praying in between, you're outsourcing your own experience of authentic practice. It could be from a scriptural perspective or from an embodied action-based perspective. Either of the practices in your faith. That was one example for Christianity. I'm not getting at Christians. It could be any religious practice, any religious text. But if you're outsourcing it to the preacher, the teacher, the guru, the guide, and you're not going there yourself, draw inspiration from them, but then take that inspiration and put it into your own works. Huge shadow. Huge shadow. And it's just enough spiritual seeking to keep people healthy. I see this in, again, I'll go with the Christian example because we've opened it up. The general cultural Christianity that's in a place like America or certain places in Europe, there's enough of a faith, but there's not that deep, enduring faith which inspires someone to read the Bible in their own time or to listen to extra information. What I mean by that is the extra information within, to develop a prayer life, to develop a relationship with your soul and with God, which is outside of the public sphere, a private relationship. This is actually something that Saint Teresa talks about in her Interior Castle, a mystical Christian teacher from the 1500s. It's an interior relationship. Many of the great Christian mystics, which I suppose I'll bring up now just on a spontaneous, you want to read a book about Christian mysticism? Read Evelyn Underhill's work, Mysticism. This book was published, I don't know if you can see it, I hope that you can. It's beautiful, beautiful text. No, I was going to say the spirituality remains blurry, but this book is fantastic. It goes into, it's going to fall apart if I bring it up. 100-year-old book, fantastic. All the Christian teachers, all the major Christian mystics, they spend a lot of time in personal contemplation, and yes, they're outsourcing to the guru or the teacher, which is the Bible. They're also outsourcing to the gurus and teachers, which are their local priests and local bishops, and yet at the same time, they're building a relationship with their own interior self, spiritual self. Just pay attention to it. We'll move on now to the 19th sign of being stuck in the spiritual shadow. Again, I recommend that you pick up Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill, but the 19th sign that you're stuck in the spiritual shadow is that you're playing God. Playing God in the form of judgment is what I want to focus on. The classic Christian phrase of don't worry about the dust in your brother's eye when you've got a plank in your own. If you are caught in a pattern subconsciously, privately, crucially, of judging other people for their moral shortcomings or the ways that they lost their temper or they're not living up to God's plan, and you seem to know God's plan and you have this righteous, vindictive feeling that you're doing it right and they're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong. I guarantee that you're doing it wrong. Even if you're in the spiritual but not religious camp and you're very understanding and very tolerant of all people's practices, you will still have these private secret beliefs of, they did the conscious communication, but they're not quite that conscious in their conscious communication. Yes, they're holding space and they're doing the ceremony, but I would have hit the sound bowl in a different way because that frequency wasn't suited to the frequency that was required from the space. Everyone needed a bit more heart chakra energy, whereas they were focusing on the throat chakra energy. It's very subtle. Very, very subtle spiritual elitism, and you're trying to play God to some degree. You have an understanding or some form of understanding about the wider spiritual principles, the spiritual philosophy that you ascribe to, and you're trying to become some kind of recipient and some kind of standard bearer for that faith. And naturally, for most people, you then end up fighting against that which you're not. It almost has adolescent psychology elements within it. When you're a teenage boy or a teenage girl, you start to develop in-group and out-group philosophies. You rebel against your parents a little bit, but also you try and find systems of belief that then become you. You might develop some kind of subculture. You might become a goth, or you become a rocker, or you become someone who's really into cars. You become someone who's like a pretty girl. Whatever it might be, all these sub-cliques, it seems unrelated, but we're doing it within religious context. We're forming cliques and cults and circles, and then we're judging those outside the circle, and normally we're judging those inside the circle even more. Oh, I can't believe that she wore that. That's not very modest. Oh, I can't believe that they didn't read that text. That's a basic spiritual text within this tradition. If you're playing God and you're casting judgments to those who are meant to be the closest to you, your spiritual brothers and sisters, just watch out for the arrogance that comes with that. And again, turn that inwards, because you're likely missing some things inside yourself. Moving now to the 20th sign of the spiritual shadow and being stuck there against your will. This is selective spiritual pleasure seeking, and I put in brackets worship, not sacrifice, and ethical work, for example. Let me tidy that up for the sake of a video. If you're looking at selective spiritual practices and you're someone who, say, for example, really enjoys the idea of forgiveness and kindness within your tradition, you're very happy to go and give to charity, you're very happy to go and get the experience of having an in-person interaction with someone who's grateful for your good works. But you're not willing to be seen, or be rather willing to be unseen, in your gestures of hidden faith, your hidden, low-grade, small acts of kindness. That's one level. That's a very basic level of praying in public, but not willing to pray in private. At a deeper level, you need to pay attention to selective practices which don't feel good at all, because the private worship, the private practice still feels good for you. At an emotional level, at a sensory level, if you're giving to the homeless person or giving to the child in need, fantastic. They literally give you a smile. If you're going on your app and you're donating to a cause, no one knows it was you, you're an anonymous donor, but you still feel the reward of that. What about the spiritual practices within your faith that just don't feel good? What about penance and fasting? What about situations where you're forced to study texts that you just don't want to read because, from your understanding of the philosophy, as strong as that might be, why would you say, oh, I'm forced to read the book? You are to some degree. You can't be a genuine spiritual seeker within your faith and not have read the main text within that faith. So you are forced to some degree by an inner calling, an inner Christian, an inner Buddhist, an inner Jewish part of you that says you need to read this book. You might use softer language, but it doesn't feel good. There's some kind of stuckness, there's a stickiness, there's a rejection of that part of you. That's selective spiritual sensory seeking and almost organizing your spiritual practices based on what feels good and what doesn't feel good and just going to one side of the spectrum. There are many parts of many practices which don't feel good. I'm not going to give you a laundry list of what doesn't feel good. You already know what doesn't feel good because you're already avoiding it. For many people, as one final example I guess that I'll give to make it practical, many spiritual but not religious types, or even conventional orthodox religious types, won't do the work necessary to emanate their energy outwards. And this can mean something like being exceptionally talented in engineering and architecture and not going through the multi-year process of actually building that charity center, for example. It's your particular skill, might not be in a spiritual context, it's just regular, mundane work. In fact, in this case, it's not even regular work, it's for a charity. What about if it's the sewage works? Not very spiritual work, it's literally the opposite. It seems like, oh, it's lesser, and yet to have a healthy sewage system for a local populace is very good. It's very life-promoting. There's all kinds of work that we need to do in the world that seems despiritualized, and we avoid it because we're selective in our spiritual practices. It's a very strong sign of spiritual shadow. It's a spiritual shadow which honestly affects all of us to some degree. I'm still looking out for myself in the ways that I just don't integrate the things that I don't want to integrate. It requires honesty. Moving now to the final few points for the video. Thank you for being here throughout this wonderful, wonderful list. And if you're feeling triggered, so am I, so don't worry. The 21st sign that you're stuck in spiritual shadow is that you believe that spiritual healing is all you need. Or maybe you're somebody who comments on psychology book videos on the internet and says, bro, you don't need that book, just read the Bible, just read the Quran, or just read the Bhagavad Gita. This is a comment I've had hundreds of times on this channel, as if trauma healing is irrelevant just because you have spiritual healing power. It's not true. Something happens to your arm in a car accident, you go to the doctor and the doctor saves your life. You don't just need faith. Prayer and belief will help. It will support that recovery process. There's loads of spiritual psychology that looks into the practice of belief and how it supports recovery. But it's not enough. In an extreme example where your life's saved through modern medicine, you need to have experts who have an expert skill outside of a spiritual system. For trauma work in particular, for healing developmental wounds, for healing attachment wounds, for healing things around addiction, you need professionals and experts and psychological systems that complement your faith. It's not enough to just read the Bible. It's not enough to just read the Bhagavad Gita. You get to do that, and you get to read other psychology books. Maybe this is a pet peeve. I'm a long point in the video right now, so I'll bring out a pet peeve for a bit of drama. When I see people leaving comments on my videos where I've made a good effort to try and bring out books like I have in this video, especially if they're trauma books, and they say, oh no, I don't need that, I've got my faith. I love that for you, but you don't have to choose. You don't have to choose between your religious convictions and making the best of what other humans have contributed to the field of health. It's such an obvious point to me, but people who are really caught in the spiritual shadow, they don't seem to be able to see it, but because they're caught in some kind of, I'm in the in-group and the out-group is all evil, it's very basic level spirituality. You get to have a deep understanding and a deep conviction that you are a spiritual person in a spiritual tradition, and you also get to benefit from modern psychology. Just a ranty point, but, sometimes people avoid the work because they think they can pray their way out of a childhood attachment issue. Maybe you can. But also, if your father did something to you, or your mother didn't do something that she should have done, it's probably best to look for a bit more guidance than just a religious text. Bit of a strong point, but it's a true point. Moving now to the final sign, the 22nd sign of being caught in the spiritual shadow. And this is that you have a very, very unfortunate bias towards your soul, to the detriment of enjoying your humanness. There's a classic phrase within the spiritual but not religious camp where they say, I'm a soul having a human experience. They identify as the soul, or they identify as dispersed, non-dual spirit, and they neglect their body. This ties back in with one of the points from the very beginning of the video, that you're caught in spiritual shadow. I think it was the third point, and it was the fourth point of tolerating toxic substances in situations. You tolerate these toxic substances because you don't even identify with your body. It's all about you and your soul and your spirit. Therefore, your flesh, your name, I'm Jordan, Jordan's nothing, these hands, it doesn't matter. Take me away. You become anti-body, and becoming anti-body means you become anti-material, and you become anti-human in a deep sense. And if you're anti-human and you're a parent, what do you think that's going to do to your relationship to your little ones? How do you think you're going to relate to their humanness, to their growing relationship to their own body? Maybe insecurities from your teenage daughter, or maybe this shame that your teenage boy has around a certain bodily process. You'll unconsciously put them further towards the philosophy that you agree with, and they're going to become dissociative, disembodied individuals who won't enjoy the beauty of their human body. It's a very, very, very toxic ideology from my perspective, because truly and surely, if we are created by God and we're created in God's image, is this body not beautiful? Is there not a beauty and a power and a radiance and a splendor in the human body? What do we create art for? Why do we fall in love? Why do we love falling into bed with someone who's good for us? Deep partnerships, deep commitments. What is it about the beauty of that act, about bringing new life into the world, which makes us feel beautiful and loved and safe? There's something about the body. Yes, beautiful romantic union should have a deep spiritual element, but don't be so fixated on it's all about the souls and it's not about the flesh, because you get to be both. It's the same as the previous point on you don't just read the Bible and then not read the psychology books. You don't just believe in the soul and not have a real, genuine appreciation for your humanness. That's all I can say there, but I do have a bonus point. It's a secret 23rd point, because I couldn't resist putting this one just as a throwaway remark right at the end as I leave the building. 23rd sign of spiritual shadow is that you have money wounds. I got to the end of this whole list and I thought, wait a minute, there's one really common issue that people always seem to have. They have a really weird relationship with money if they grew up in a certain religious culture. Christians especially, but I've seen people who've also grew up in Muslim conditions, sometimes in Jewish situations or other organized faiths. There's all kinds of twisting around money. There's these ideas of money being evil, money being satanic, money being something which pollutes and corrupts. There's a whole conversation there. There's many hours I could go into it, but the money wound is a really common sign of spiritual shadow. And it gets in the way of your day-to-day existence because you need money to be able to get along with other people, to be able to get along with yourself, and to be able to contribute back to society. A certain amount of money, a certain amount of health in relationship to money. And this almost is tied into the anti-body, anti-human perspective of someone who's spiritually shadowy and only believes in the soul. Someone who truly over-identifies in a spiritually grandiose way with their spiritual self. They reject human systems. They reject money systems. They reject systems of education, systems of government, systems of politics, systems of education, because they only identify as a spiritual self or the godly text, whatever it might be. Just watch out for these common pitfalls. I've done everything I possibly can in this video. I will wrap up by giving you once more another opportunity to pick up Embodied Spirituality in a Sacred World by Michael Washburn. This is a top tier text. You can go into wonderful Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson, which is another wonderful text. And you can read Meeting the Shadow essay collection, Halfway Up the Mountain essay collection, and Spiritual Emergency essay collection. Don't miss the opportunity. Go over to your favorite secondhand bookseller and just go deeper. If there's only one book that you're going to read, I recommend you read this book. There's not going to be many more copies left in the world because they're not printing it anymore. Not sure when this one was published. I think it might be the early 2000s potentially. This one was published 1999. 25-year-old book, pretty much summarizing all of the major themes I've discussed in this video. Don't miss the opportunity, and make sure that if you find yourself halfway up the mountain, you either have the humility to go back down and resupply yourself so you can keep going further. You have the perspective of not doing it alone. You want to bring other people up with you, and ultimately you have the courage, the conviction, and the endurance to keep going further on the journey. And fundamentally, avoid the arrogance of pretending that you're at the top of the mountain just because people are below you. You still have much, much further to go, and I'm right there with you. We're all genuine spiritual seekers trying to make genuine spiritual change in the world, and if we are willing to look at our shadow territories, our shadow entities, and our shadow behaviors with an honest degree of introspection, hopefully we'll be able to give back, and hopefully, genuinely, we'll feel much better on the inside because there'll be less fragmentation, there'll be more coherence, and we'll be the self-integrated soul. I'll see you in the comment section. Make sure to pick up the books.